In this video, I will discuss in detail the Corpuscular theory by Paul of Toronto and Paracelsus' the theory of microcosm and macrocosm. But before we get into Paul of Toronto and his corpuscular theory and Paracelsus' microcosm, macrocosm, we need to go back, way back. In fact, we're going to go back so far, we're going to go back to a philosopher, a Greek philosopher, rationalist, named Heraclitus. This predates Plato. So we have to lay the foundations here where these ideas come from. So by doing that, we're going to discuss Heraclitus' idea and then move on to the corpuscular theory. No, we're going to Plato, then the corpuscular theory, and then Paracelsus. So in this podcast, we're going to explore these ideas. So Heraclitus, who was Heraclitus? Well, like I said, he was the first Greek rationalist, ancient Orphic, from the ancient Orphic cults there. He was from the 6th century BC, very old, an ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher. The central ideas basically of Heraclitus was the philosophy of now this is important, the unity of opposites or the contradictions and the concept of change or movement. The things are always in flux, always changing all the time. Now this is important because it sets us up for Plato later on, you'll see. So basically the phenomena of this change requires the existence of many contradictions. It requires that things are and are not the same. So let's have Leonard Peikoff use the match analogy to describe and to show in more detail, and he does the best job of it, of what we're talking about here, how it requires that things are and are not the same.
Now I've just plucked this match. This is still the same match that I had a second ago. It's still the same match, right? I mean, I didn't take the original match and throw it away and substitute a new match. That would be substitution, but I didn't do that. I still have the same match. All right, this is still the same match. I'm now going to make it go through a process of change. Still the same. All right. Here's the process of change now. All right. Now, is this still the same match? Obviously, it is. Still the same match. I didn't substitute another one. But it obviously is not the same match because it has changed. The tip is now hot and it used to be cold, and it's now black and it used to be white, and so on and so on. Says Heraclitus, this match is therefore the same as it was at the beginning, and yet it has changed. It is not the same as it was at the beginning. At the same time, namely after the change, it is what it was, but it is not what it was. It is and is not. It's the same and not the same. It's A and not A at the same time, which is a contradiction. Now, could we give another example? Oh, yes. Heraclitus is going to give all sorts. For instance, take...
So basically, Heraclitus says that this match is the same as it was the beginning, and yet it has changed. So it is not the same as it was the beginning. Another example, and this relates to Paracelsus here, would be a tree, a living tree or a dead tree. Now, the difference between them is the essence of life, or what you might call, since it's a tree, we might call it the vegetative soul or the vegetable soul. The essence of life is what's missing within the dead tree. So the tree is dead, but what's missing is this essence. Now, Paracelsus believes something a little bit different than that, but we'll get into that later. So the dead tree still contains its substantial universal or outer form of the tree, the wood, the bark, whatever, and this universal form must have been there all along. But it isn't the same because it's missing its essence. So it does kind of draw on the same idea as Heraclitus here. But the thing is that this change is the most obvious fact. No one can deny that it's changed. Therefore, the only conclusion can be the world is riddled with contradictions. That's important to Heraclitus' idea. You have to have contradictions, filled with things which are and are not. And there have been other people who believe in this same kind of idea by Heraclitus of progress, progressivism, movement. Hitler believed in the idea that his Weltanschauung was a movement, moving. Scheller, Frederick Engels, John Dewey, progressives. So now this brings us to Plato. Now we go from Heraclitus, now we go to Plato and Plato's Metaphysics. So the idea of the perceptible world and the world of ideal forms. So Plato's world of forms, or Plato's cave, is the reality versus the appearance in Plato's cave. This so-called world of forms, and if you ever heard of Plato's cave, this is what it's pretty much about. But if you've already ever heard of it, well, we're going to do a recap, so bear with me here. So we're all in this cave together watching the shadows on the wall, right? We see shadows being cast on the wall. And what we need to do is realize that we're living in a fake reality. It's not real. We're just seeing these shadows cast from another reality and then come out of the cave into the real world. So how do we come out of this, what you call this matrix, right? Well, Plato, he basically said that everything was split into two worlds. The concrete material things, we kind of talked about that with Heraclitus a little bit, and the abstract concept or forms. In the case of the tree, maintains its forms. So you have concrete material things or particulars versus the abstract conceptual forms. So, I mean, the more technical terms are particulars and universals, but we're just going to refer to them as material forms, material and forms from now on. So, continuing on, Plato said forms, concepts of the mind, universal, are never changing, whereas concrete materials, things are, particulars are always changing. Therefore, the world of forms is the concrete real form, and the material world is just a reflection of the true reality, the hologram maybe. And to explain this even further, Plato had created a story about a great craftsman, an artisan, or you might say a great architecture of the universe. Kind of sounds like God, or as my demiurgus from the Greek. A God that produced the material world. Now we'll get into the differences of this material world, whether it's perfect or imperfect, a little bit later. But in fact, Plato's demiurgus is the ancestor of the ancestors of their Christian gods. So it may sound familiar because it is. But something that's worth noting here about the demiurge is not the creator of the world forms, okay? He just creates the imperfect. There we go. I told you we get to that later. The imperfect material world by looking at the perfect world of forms and taking it as the inspiration for his art, you might say. However, there is a difference. So when you might ask, like, what creates the world forms? According to Plato, Plato is this idea of the ultimate form, which he calls the form of the good. The form of the good is there at the very tippy top of whatever you want to call it, a pyramid or whatever, is the top thing. And from that, everything else is created, starting with the heavens, and then the demiurgus, and then the material world, and then all the way down. Plato then decided that it's not possible for humans to grasp. It's impossible to grasp God. It's beyond their knowledge, or gnosis, or the form of the good. He continues on. Plato says, according to Plato, in order to grasp the known or the gnosis, the form of the good, you must transcend the intellect. Now, that's very hermetic, transcending, isn't it? Transcending the 7 planetary spheres, achieving ascendance. Okay? And he had this vision and this sort of, you do this through like a revelation, you might say. Going back to Leonard Peikoff, Peikoff says that this is what we call the mysticism. The view that knowledge isn't gained by perception, but by obtainable only by spirituality. So there's no sense of perception of the objective world. There's just a spiritual awakening. That's all you can do this. And Plato, therefore, is the father of mysticism in Western philosophy, and is from Plato or Heraclitus that the cult belief system seeped into our modern world. So you might want to think about modern cults and how that works as well. And Plato also continues here with this idea what he calls the macrocosms, the concrete material things, or particulars. This is kind of summing up here. And the macrocosms, the sort of abstract concepts called forms, concepts of the mind, never changing. So there's the outer world and there's the inner world. That's that kind of, we get into that in a lot of Hermeticism too. So in other words, the essence of reality is change. It's not about being, it's always about becoming, changing, evolving. Benito Mussolini talked about how his doctrine of fascism, or his idea of fascism, was always changing, is always fluid. It was never stationary. This is why he destroyed his doctrine of fascism in 1940, because he didn't want anything concrete, because he believed in this ever-changing flux and this sort of perpetual revolution, like the typical Marxist that he was. Everything is changing in every aspect, at every instant. Nothing remains the same for 2 consecutive instances. Yeah, you never can just be a woman, like in gender ideology. You have to just constantly become one, always becoming one. So you get into that aspect as well. And yes, gender ideology is a Hermetic death cult and relates to here as well. So let's hear what Heraclitus has to say when he talks about you can't step into the same water twice, right? You're talking about a river. So you can't step in this river twice because it's always changing. There's always fresh waters that are always flowing in. Okay, so the one thing you have to understand as well is that since this ideas are based on contradictions, you have to have contradictions. If you go into Hegel, he believed that you need to get rid of these contradictions in order until there are no distinctions left. There's nothing left. So that kind of goes to Hegel as well. So you might want to check him out and read some of his stuff. And so that pretty much covers Heraclitus. Now we're going to move on to the corpuscular theory by Paul of Toronto. He was in the 13th century. We don't have any specific dates when he was born or when he died. So that's how this we can do, 13th century. So Paul of Toronto was a 13th century Franciscan alchemist. There's the Hermetic stuff. Perhaps the best known of his works is the Theoretica et Practica, theory and practice. Now that's a very important concept. That continues on from Heraclitus all the way to Hegel, Kant, even to Karl Marx himself when he created his theory of theory and praxis, or praxis. He called it praxis, of doing, right? So the theory is you might say, the gnosis, and the praxis or practice is the Hermetic. You get it now? It's all related to these cults. So which he defends as alchemical principles by describing the theoretical gnosis, again, the practical Hermetic reasoning behind it. So Hegel figured out a way to marry these two things of gnosis and Hermeticism and created something very dangerous from that. But that's another story for another video. Let's go on here about Paul of Toronto, because we don't want to have this podcast go on forever. So let's continue on here. Okay, so what was important, or indeed you might say revolutionary, about Paul of Toronto's books is the adoption of the corpuscular interpretation of the elements. Okay, we're going to get into the corpuscular theory of lights. Corpuscular, you might know, it states that these lights that we see, the light emanating from the sun, are made up of small, discrete particles called corpuscles. Corpuscles. Little particles, you might say, which travel in a straight line with a finite velocity and possesses impetus. Okay, this was based on an alternate description of atomism, or atomism, you might say, of the period. And of course, if you heard of this corpuscular theory of light, you know who invented this idea was Isaac Newton. He pretty much laid the foundations for this theory throughout his whole work on optics. This early conception of the particle theory of light was an early forerunner to the modern understanding of the light photons. Einstein kind of talked about the photons of light being particles of light, or little packets of light. But anyway, that's another thing. So anyway, but continue on here. According to Paul, the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, exist in the form of tiny corpuscles. Corpuscles of the earth bond with one another in tight clusters to form larger corpuscles of the earth. Though very tightly bonded, the original tiny corpuscles retain their identity, their essence. However, when we talked about the tree, in context of Heraclitus, he doesn't believe that the tree retains the essence. It loses its essence, but retains its universal form, the wood. So this is a little bit different than Heraclitus. The same, but different. That's how these Hermetic ideas always work. They're always borrowing things out of the same, but changing just a little bit. Even Hegel does this, and Marx does this to Hegel, and back and forth. They're always changing things, but they're still keeping the general essence of the theories. To continue on, these larger corpuscles of the Earth then form tight clusters with larger corpuscles. They're in the microcosm versus the macrocosm of the other elements in various proportions to form the material of which metals and other substances consist. So he's applying this idea of the corpuscular theory of light to elements, and in the context of alchemy. However, because the smaller corpuscles retain their identities, their essences, within the larger corpuscles, they may be called upon as what you call a second or casual or explanatory level. The properties of a given substance, the metal for example, can be attributed either to the original tiny corpuscles, the original, or the larger clusters. So this is relating back to Heraclitus again, where it retains something of the original, and it represents the larger whole. What we have here is a corpuscular theory of matter instead of light, resembling that of the ancient atomists. We said that before. Differing, however, in that the atoms of Paul of Toronto do not represent the end process of division. The ever-changing, there it is. It does not represent the end process of division. It continues on forever. There it is, back to the idea. Heraclitus, things are changing, always moving towards something. Progressivism, movement, flux, fluidity. However, they are themselves composites of still smaller entities. So it's ever-changing. And this you can see where people like Lenin or Marx get their idea of a perpetual revolution, even Mussolini, who was a Marxist. So always in a state of flux, change, movement. Hitler describes his Weltanschauung as a movement, moving. So we have these sort of two layers of causation. Okay, so let's hear from Paul of Toronto himself what he argues. When metals are resolved into their fundamental constituents by the calcination, if there were a complete resolution to the simple elements, not to certain intermediate mineral or metallic principles, which are nearer than the first simple bodies, the smaller ones, Aristotle for elements, think of that. The metal or such, and such a body would no more return from them upon its exposure to fire. He's alchemist. He's talking about converting things. Then anything else made up of the simple elements, and gold would no more return from gold than would stone or wood. So it's a simulacrum of it. It retains the essence of it. However, it doesn't retain the essence of it. It is, but it isn't. So it's not really gold. It's sort of like what he might say it's a metaphor for gold. Or like in gender ideology, you're just a metaphor for a woman. You're not really actually turning yourself into a woman or the opposite sex. You're just sort of a metaphysical or metaphoric thing like that. So you can see how all these cults are intermingled and have been around for centuries. So Paul continues, especially since fire is a common agent, going back to elements, behaving like towards all each other. But since these metals and minerals return just the same as before, it is manifest that they're only resolved to a certain components. They're not the same. They formed a new unity. Now that sounds really familiar. That sounds kind of like Hegel, doesn't it? Thesis, antithesis, reconciliation. So on the reconciliation part is this, where it manifests itself or synchronizes itself into a new kind of unity, a new kind of gold, or whatever you're trying to do. Components of theirs. And back to Paul again, not the simple elements or to the prime matter, as those aforesaid philosophers mistakenly assert. Talking about some other philosophers, he says they're mistaken because, according to Paul of Toronto, he has true knowledge, so all the other philosophers were wrong. Okay, so in a sense here, let me summarize here a little bit. The larger corpuscles mimic nature, right? Creates a simulacrum, or sort of a new version of it, in which the form is hidden inside the smaller circles. Whereas Heraclitus, it does not retain the essence. It retains the universal form. That's different. All you have to do is just let it out of its prison. Like an alchemist, you can control these things with your hands and intellect, right? You kind of got the gnosis and the practice going on at the same time, so to speak. For example, Another good example in art, a painting is not real, right? It's not real, no matter how real it looks, because there are only two types of art, right? The artificial, right? The simulacrum, the shadows on the cave, and the intrinsic form, the universal form, the perfected art. You perfected the world. One, you are really painting on a canvas, yes, or you're duplicating nature, or duplicating a woman, whatever you're trying to do, but you're doing it better than nature. These kind of beliefs too also are sort of progenitor to the idea of how man is better than nature, has perfected nature. Because, hey, humans made it. Okay. So, in other words, if you want to think in context of numbers, you can say the smaller number can exist within a larger number, 3 of 4, 2 of 3, that kind of thing. And back to the example again to finish up here and about the tree and how this is different than Heraclitus, where you have a live tree and a dead tree. The differences between them is that the essence of life, or vegetative soul, or vegetable soul, the essence of life is what's missing in the dead tree. However, in the smaller corpuscles of the microscopic world, the essence is retained. So that's the difference. Paul of Toronto, the essence is retained. Heraclitus, the essence is gone. The dead tree still contains its substantial outer form, universal form, the tree form, the wood. The universal form has been there all along, but it's a little bit different. Something's missing. It's always changing, and it's always turning into something new, but drawing on some of the more living elements of its predecessors. Okay, now we move on to Paracelsus. I hope I'm saying his name right. 1493 to 1541. This podcast has already gone pretty long, so let's wrap it up with him. And this is pretty much goes back to the microcosm and macrocosm, which is kind of the similar to Heraclitus, Plato, and Paul of Toronto. Okay, so Paracelsus, let no man belong to another that can belong to himself. So Paracelsus, he was basically a pioneer in several aspects of medical revolution. Again, a quote, revolutionary, of the Renaissance, emphasizing the value of observation in combination with received wisdom. Aha, that's the difference between Plato. Plato's a rationalist. Heraclitus a rationalist. He can rationalize the world. But here, Paracelsus does the combination. Says we can observe the world. However, we need received gnosis. We need that special knowledge to observe the world and analyze it. So Paracelsus has developed a chemicular rather than alchemical vision of the world that encompasses the theory and practice. There it is again, Gnosis and Hermeticism, theory, practice of medicine and astrology. His influence may be seen operating in several directions, and his contribution has been of some of the most importance, not only in the domain of esotericism, Hermeticism, but more generally in Renaissance philosophy and the history of science. Well, of course, his ideas have been especially congenial in the German mind. Okay, well, that's something for another video. We don't want to get into the German mind yet when you go from Immanuel Kant, and then you go to Hegel, and then you keep going there, and you get Hitler eventually, but we'll get to that later, on which he has had a powerful hold upon present day. Oh, I forgot Nietzsche before Hitler. Okay, back to his speculations. He speculated the analogies and correspondences, the law of correspondences, as above, so below, as above, between the macrocosm, the outer, the big, and the microcosm, little. And he says that it's linked to the belief that man unites within himself all the elements of the world. So you're the center of the world, of the universe. And according to Paracelsus' Book of Nature, might, this is what he says, he's quoting the book here, might out of all those things which in this our age God doth so richly bestow upon us, collect liberum naturale. And he rejoices here that finally man might thereby be begotten or understood his own nobleness and worth, and why he is called microcosm, or the little corpuscles. And how far is knowledge extendeth to the nature, gnosis? How far does it go? Again, this guy wants to perfect nature. Okay, so let's go on here. I think what's important here, and let's finish up here with Paracelsus, because I think we kind of hit on the most important points about these ideas and how they go back to Heraclitus. So according to Paracelsus, and I think we kind of gleaned that from what we just talked about, Paracelsus' idea of macrocosm and microcosm, man being the microcosm. Since man is the microcosm, he is the center of Paracelsus' cosmos. Man is the quinta essentia, he contains all the spirits or essences of all other things. So he believes in the maintaining of the spirit, the essence of other things. And thus man, as the microcosm, can achieve knowledge, gnosis, of the whole by looking within himself. Thus, in true Hermetic fashion, Paracelsus identifies self-knowledge and knowledge of the world. To know nature is to know it in terms of the being, which it is telos, man. Man is not, however, merely a passive product of God's will, for Paracelsus holds that God created the world in an imperfect state. That's very Gnosticistic. Now, is it? The Gnostics also believe that the demiurge created an imperfect state. So therefore, it's man's role to bring the world to perfection. So you can see where these ideas, these sort of utopian ideas, come from Heraclitus and Plato. Plato's claim specifically when you see the reflections of a better world onto the cave, right? And we want to create this better world, since we're seeing a gleam of it on the cave walls. We want to create this real world, this heavenly world beyond our world. We want to create this heaven on earth. Because now we got the gnosis, now we got the way to do it, and we can create this heaven on earth. And we know that resulted in horrible things like Stalin and Hitler and Mao and all kinds of other utopian ideas that thought even Mao believed that he was better than nature and transcended nature, and that he can dominate nature and he can create a perfect world on earth because he gleaned what a perfect world looks like. That's different than Christianity. The Christian's the opposite. We know there's a heaven and another world, but we're not trying to create that heaven on earth. We're trying to ascend to it. So in other words, back to the finish up here. The created world has been given over to man in order that he may fulfill it. Yeah, create a perfect heaven on earth. More than that, keeps going, man's original and specific mission is to lead it to perfection. You've got the knowledge now. Let's perfect the world and create our perfect heaven on earth. He has been placed in the world solely for this purpose. So you can see here how these ideas have traveled through time, and they can lead to really horrible things in history, and how it's this belief that we can create heaven on earth through these ideas. So if I were to say at the end of the day there, I would say I would pick Aristotle over any of these other rationalist Greek philosophers, because their idea, like Immanuel Kant, and how the misinterpretation of the French Revolution misinterpreted Immanuel Kant, they can create a perfectly rational world because they have gleaned what a perfect world looks like, and now they're going to create it hell on earth. They say heaven, but it's going to be hell. Trust me. All right. Thanks for joining. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Leave a like and subscribe. And don't forget that you can become a subscriber through Subscribestar for as little as $1 per month. So I hope you enjoyed today's content. Well, I couldn't even say it. Enjoyed today's content. And let me know what you think in the comment section below. And I'll be glad to hear from you. That's all. And thanks for coming out.